John Cassidy is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he's covered economics and politics for 30 years. He wrote the books How Markets Fail and Dot.Con, How America Lost Its Mind and Money in the Internet Era. He's also the author of the new book, Capitalism and Its Critics, A History from the Industrial Revolution to AI. John Cassidy, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks very much for inviting me on and reminding me how old I am, 30 years.
Well, you started writing this book back during the 2016 American presidential campaign. What did you see happening in American politics that made you want to write a history of the critiques of capitalism?
Well, I mean, if you go back to 2016, obviously it turned out to be a historic election. And during the campaign, it seemed to me it was already pretty historic because for the first time in about a century, I would say, you had two major candidates running with critiques of capitalism from the left and the right. Obviously, Bernie Sanders with a critique from the left, but Trump, people forget, ran as a sort of, I wouldn't say he's an anti-capitalist at all, but he had a critique that American capitalism was basically selling out people and, shipping all the jobs abroad, etc. And he was also very critical of Wall Street banks at that point, even though, of course, once he got elected, he put a bunch of bankers in his cabinet. But there was this critique from the right and the left, which it seemed to me was a sort of emerging sort of crisis of legitimacy of the system that we hadn't really seen since the 1930s. So I thought I'd write a book about how that came about. I thought there was a book in it. And I originally thought I'd start with a much shorter book, basically taking it back to the end of the Cold War. But then I realized, number one, there've been a lot of those books written, basically histories of neoliberalism. And number two, once you get into the sort of critiques of capitalism, you find out that many of them go back much further than the end of the Cold War. They go back to the very beginnings of the system. So eventually I decided to change the focus of the book to basically a history of the world over the last 250 years, or a history of capitalism, but told through the eyes of the critics. It's not a history of individual businesses. It's a history of trends told through the critics at the time, about 28 of them. There are 28 chapters. Some of them are individuals and some are groups.
Yeah,
so that's where the book came from, and that's the structure of the book.
Yeah, and I love how it explores, as you said, the critiques of dozens of economists and philosophers over that 250-year time period, and those critiques are set amidst the historical context of the time, right? That those people were living in, and how important to you was it to look at these critiques from their perspective, the perspective of the time when those critiques were actually being made?
I mean, fundamental. I mean, this is a history book, not a political tract. And I'm a New Yorker journalist, so I use the subjects as sort of vehicles to try and tell a larger story, which we do at the New Yorker all the time. So it's a sort of blend of, I would say, biography, economic analysis, and larger sort of political and social history. I think that's, if I'd say what distinguishes it from other books of capitalism, I'd say that the combination of those three things. You can really tell a lot of the story through the individual critics. I'm sure we'll get onto some of them, because, as you say, they're living through it all. And if you go back, and I really tried to make a big effort to go back to the original sources, not just to rely on secondary biographies, although I did rely on some of those for biographical details. But in terms of the actual theories and critiques, I went back to the original sources, starting, with Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. So that, I think that's what gives the book its sort of, if it has merit, that's the basis of the merit.
Well, you said you went all the way back to the beginning of capitalism. So let's start there. Based on your research, when do you argue that capitalism, quote unquote, began, and what did it replace as the main economic system?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a huge academic debate about when capitalism began. I tried to avoid that. My view is that there was I start basically with the Industrial Revolution. But there was a pre-existing form of capitalism called mercantile capitalism, which was based on colonialism. I have a chapter on the East India Company, which was a huge English trading company, which basically bought primary products in Indonesia and India, and shipped them back to the UK. and it was very protectionist. They had to use British. If you want to import goods into Britain, you had to use British ships. The East India Company had a monopoly. So this was a protectionist global system. It also involved slavery. The East India Company wasn't heavily involved in slavery, but the Africa Company was, another British company. The triangular trade itself was a global system. I argue it was a form of capitalism. The plantations were very large for their size. So there was a pre-existing capitalism. But so I don't. There's sort of doctrinal argument about when, was that real capitalism? I sort of try and elide all that and just say I'm starting with the rise of industrial capitalism, and I start with the East India Company in 1770, and then move on to Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Now, of course, Adam Smith, not usually regarded as a critic of capitalism, usually seen as the patron saint of capitalism. When I started reporting on the US back in the 1980s, and I lived in Washington covering the George H.W. Bush administration and actually the end of the Reagan administration, the right-wing conservatives at the time used to wear Adam Smith badges. That was the Adam Smith Society was huge. So obviously Adam Smith, not a radical lefty, but in his time he was a big critic of mercantile capitalism. In fact, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. He says in the introduction to critique mercantile capitalism because he was anti-protectionism, he was anti-monopoly, and he was anti-slavery, largely on economics rather than moral grounds. So I present Smith as a critic of the capitalism of his time.
Yeah, and do you think Smith would be a critic of capitalism today, especially the financialization?
I think he would be a supporter of competitive capitalism. The famous passages about how you rely on the butcher and the candlestick maker, and so he was a big, obviously, the division of labor and competition and the profit motive, he was a big defender of. He thought that was the key to progress. But I think he would be very critical of the tech monopolies, for example. He hated monopolies. And he was also very suspicious of joint stock companies, i.e. what we call, just modern corporations, which issue stock, which were a sort of novelty, not novelty, but they were, to him, they were an abomination because he thought the insiders would just sort of enrich themselves to the detriment of the shareholders and the employees, which is what happened at the East India Company, and of course happens today as well a lot of the time. So I think he would be a defender of capitalism, but he'd probably be at somewhere like the Cato Institute or somewhere arguing for competition and antitrust and with sort of 19th century competitive capitalism.
I think we think now of like Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx as more of your famous capitalist critiques. They were witnessing the destructive power of capitalism during the mid to late 1800s. What was it that they were seeing at the time that drove them to write really such foundational works as Capital as well as the Communist Manifesto?
Well, they were basically witnessing the early decades of the Industrial Revolution. They weren't the first to come up with a sort of socialist critique or the critique of the sort of labor theory of value, that the labor workers were being screwed basically because they weren't receiving the whole of the product because the capitalists owning the means of production were able to take some of it. That critique actually came out of early 19th century English socialists and British socialists and some French ones too, who I write about. I write about one of the precursors to Marx, William Thomson. But they were basically looking at the rise of the factory industry. And Marx and Engels the same. Engels moved to Manchester in 1842. Engels is an incredible character because not only was he a communist revolutionary, he was also a capitalist. His family owned textile mills. They were co-owners. They owned some in Barmen in Germany, and they were co-owners of a mill and then two mills in Manchester, which was the sort of Pittsburgh of England at the time. And he went to work there and spent a couple of years there and wrote a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is widely regarded as a classic now. Then he went to be a revolutionary for 5 years or so with Marx in Paris and Germany. It was the 1848 revolution. They had great hopes for it. It failed. And then he went back to work. And he went back to work at the factory for the next 20 years and sent money to Marx, who was in London, who was busy writing Das Kapital, as you said, and many other things. But anyway, get back to your question, I think there were several bases of their critiques. One was a moral one, the argument that capitalism, especially industrial capitalism, the factory system, is basically dehumanizing. I mean, there were very few factory laws at the time, so women and children were working long hours, men were working even longer hours. It was very, strict. Wages were very low; they weren't rising. So there was the argument that A, it was dehumanizing, B, it was exploitative, because for the first few decades, the Industrial Revolution, wages didn't rise or rose very slowly, whereas profits rose very quickly. So that leads to obviously rising inequality. Marx and Engels, in their original formulation, made the argument that the workers not only are screwed, but they're immiserated, that they're basically, impoverished. They're never going to rise out of poverty. And that was the basis of their revolutionary argument. Why is capitalism doomed? Because eventually the workers, the proletariat, will rise up. They won't accept immiseration indefinitely. So the system is doomed. Now, just as a technical thing, the reason that prediction failed is because wages did actually start to rise in about the 1840s in England, and been steady increase over the centuries since then. But so they had an economic critique and they had a moral critique. I think that was the strength of their argument, and why it was picked up by so many followers. Because I think most people, when they look at capitalism, the average person in the street, they probably have a moral critique of it, that they're just being ripped off, high prices. Especially now we have surveillance capitalism, and obviously who likes the tech monopolies? Not many people. And now we have threat of AI as well, obviously, which we can get onto. But there's that moral critique, which is, I think, what sort of motivates a lot of just the political animus towards capitalism. And that's obviously what Bernie Sanders was capitalizing on in 2016, because there's been an enormous rise in inequality in the US and the rise of the billionaire class. But then there's all been over the centuries this economic critique, various economic critiques of capitalism. One, is it exploitative? Two, is it stable? Does it lead to sort of crises, which is sort of bring it down eventually? And three, does it just lead inevitably to monopoly capitalism, which is what Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and people argued. And that was based on the rise of the big trusts in the late 19th century. And we've seen something very similar over the last 20 or 30 years since the rise of the information economy, because there are the forces in the modern information economy, basically declining costs, rising and increasing returns to scale, which lead the market to tip in the direction of monopoly. So I think all those arguments, that's the thing about the book. The arguments, Marx and Engels put them forward. It seemed like they'd lost the argument. There wasn't a revolution in Britain, or there wasn't a revolution in Germany. The only place there was a revolution was in a rural country, Russia. So it looked like they lost the argument, but the actual substance of their arguments, and they weren't all Marxists. I mean, I write about liberal critics of capitalism too, such as John Hobson, the British critic of imperialism. It's amazing how the same arguments come up every generation. When that would tell you, that they're getting to something intrinsic about the system.
Yeah, sometimes I hear people who may be apologizing for capitalism, or they may describe the destructive economic system that we're living under today as exploitative capitalism, right? It's not capitalism, but it's just this version is exploitative. But reading the critiques of Marx and so many other people in the book, it seems that every version of capitalism has relied on some sort of exploitation, be it exploitation of labor or the environment or even consumers or many others. I mean, in your view, does capitalism rely on exploitation in order to maximize profits?
I mean, exploitation is a sort of, I wouldn't say it's a loaded term, but it's a strong term. It's certainly, I mean, just as a matter of, the thing about capitalism is incredibly productive and incredibly destructive. I mean, Joseph Schumpeter coined the term creative destruction, which the concept goes back to Marx himself, who argued that competition forces capitalists to innovate, because his is a competitive capitalism because he was writing in the mid-19th century when there was competition. So if you don't innovate, your competitors are going to innovate and they're going to take over. So there's constant incentive to invest in new means of production, new forms of technology, etc. Now, what we found over the centuries is that, very profound insight, because that's what leads to productivity growth and wage growth. Now, at the same time you get that, there is a tendency for, the capitalist classes, whatever you want to call them, people who own the means of production, to take as much of it as they can. And that's the sort of labor exploitation side of it. That's why you need, what we found, you need a sort of countervailing power to that. That's why unions and the labor movement were so important, because they had sort of countervailing bargaining power. I always say, that if the reason Marx and Engels, their predictions were wrong, it wasn't because they were mistaken in the basis of their time, but they didn't foresee the rise of labor unions and government itself, things like social insurance. So is capitalism exploitative? Yes, it is, but there are things which can be done against that to countervail that through supporting labor power, setting up social insurance nets. There is a version of managed capitalism. But to go back to the sort of, we're on a climate podcast, the exploitation of natural resources has always been a fundamental part of capitalism. There's no getting away from that. Even John Stuart Mill, who was a big defender of capitalism in the 19th century, was also an environmentalist and pointed to the destruction of virgin lands, etc., which he described as the species' common inheritance. So there's always been that tension there, and maybe there'll be some post-capitalist system which doesn't depend on exploiting natural resources, but that has always been an intrinsic part of the system. So I think the critique from the left that capitalism is based on, not the left, the environmental left, is based on exploitation of natural resources is true. Communism was based on it too in the Soviet Union and sort of third world type communism. But according to some measures, the Soviet Union was a bigger polluter per capita than the US, because it's heavy industry, which is obviously the great polluter, and they followed that route. But industrial capitalism or state capitalism, which I guess you'd call the Russian system or the modern Chinese system, sure, they inherently rely on exploiting natural resources.
Yeah, you touched on Marx's law of accumulation there, where these corporations are constantly reinvesting their profits in order to grow. And compete, quote unquote, competes. But that's one of the things that, we've seen so devastating for the planet is this kind of insatiable growth or insatiable hunger for growth. Jumping ahead 100 years or so after Marx, you have Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, right, the Romanian economist who wrote The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, which touched on this. So what was the main argument in that book?
Right. It's fascinating, really. You got to sort of place it in context. Georgescu-Roegen was a Romanian genius, basically, who grew up in rural Romania and was a math prodigy at the University of Bucharest. He then went to do a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris with some very eminent French mathematicians, including Hein Borel. Then moved to London, where he did mathematical statistics with Karl Pearson, another giant of his field who happened to be a eugenicist, but he was still a statistical giant. And then he moved to the US. He got a Rockefeller Foundation scholarship to Harvard in the 1930s, where he was hanging out with people like Galbraith and Paul Samuelson, Alvin Hansen, all the sort of giants of American Keynesian economics as it went on. So yeah, and he became an economic theorist. Then, for reasons which never fully explained, went back to Romania for 10 years. And when he came back, the Harvard job he'd been offered had sort of lapsed. So he went to Vanderbilt and spent the next 30 years at Vanderbilt. Anyway, so he was basically a theoretician. But in the post-war era, he became very interested in the environment and basically was the first one to make, not the first economist, obviously other people have made the argument, but the first sort of serious economist to make the argument that capitalism or the modern economic system was unsustainable. And his argument was, he made it in physical terms, invoking the law of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, saying that put a limit to the carrying capacity of the economy, basically. Now, there's controversy as to whether he misinterpreted the second law of thermodynamics, because he said it applied to physical objects. Most physicists don't agree with that, but that's a sort of technical argument. The thrust of his book was that there were a limit to the natural resources and strict limits on how, just how much capacity the economic capacity of the world could support. And he very early, the law of entropy came out in 1971, and he was making arguments for what we would now call degrowth. And he made the argument that anything we do now, basically any energy intensive form of production is restricting the lives of future people. He basically made a famous quote saying any Cadillac that's built today means fewer lives in the future. That produced a huge, well, it appeared the year before another very important book, The Limits to Growth, by some systems engineers up at MIT, who made the argument on technological grounds, very similar argument, that the Earth was reaching its carrying capacity, and it just wouldn't be able to support sort of very large populations. So then that led to the original argument about growth, which Georgescu-Roegen played a big role in the 1970s. The sort of standard Keynesian neoclassical economists came back at them and said, you guys have got it wrong. You're underestimating the power of technical progress. Sure, if we just use resources up at the rate we're using them up, we're going to run out. But technical progress will be able to do things like increase the reduce carbon emissions, make engines more efficient, make cars more efficient, make industrial processes more efficient, etc. Robert Solow, a famous economist at MIT, made this argument very strongly. Some British economists made the argument, and it seemed for a while that they were sort of winning the argument, because after the oil price shock in the 1970s, that did shock the system into making energy economies. The big gas guzzlers disappeared for a couple of decades. Even America started making smaller cars. The fuel emission standards, which California had introduced in the 1960s, started to spread across the country. So, energy became more efficient. But ultimately, of course, Georgescu-Roegen and the Meadows were vindicated when it became clear we had this terrible problem of climate change, and the existing stock of carbon in the air was a huge problem, not to mention the future stocks of carbon. So Georgescu-Roegen was really the sort of prophet of degrowth, I would say, and of sort of modern, the modern degrowth movement. In fact, his book was picked up by some French activists in the 1990s, and that's where the degrowth movement really started, then spread to Britain, and is now very strong in parts of Europe, and obviously has supporters in the US too, although I don't think it's as strong here as it is over there. So yeah, no, I think Georgescu-Roegen I think he's the modern economist that people don't know about, which they should know about, if you know what I mean. He's nowhere near as famous as people like Milton Friedman and Paul Samuelson, or Thomas Piketty, who I also write about, but he should be.
Yeah, I totally agree. But even before Georgescu-Roegen, there was J.C. Kumarappa, who's also arguing for a more sustainable approach to the economy. So for our listeners, who was Kumarappa, and what were his thoughts?
Kumarappa is another forgotten figure of modern economics, although he's starting to be rediscovered a bit, partly through my efforts, I hope. But I obviously wasn't the first one who's sort of picked up on him. Kumarappa is another fascinating character, an Indian economist who was born in southern India, moved to London to become an accountant, and trained as an accountant. And also came to New York when he was young, went to Columbia and did a master's program in economics and public policy. Then went back to India and set up as a businessman in Bombay it was called at the time. He was a successful accountant, and he got a message one day to go and see Mahatma Gandhi, who was the great Indian leader of the Congress Party. at his ashram in central India, and he went to see him, and they really hit it off. And Gandhi asked Kumarappa to come and join his movement, and he did. So he became Gandhi's economist basically for the next 20 years. So part of the thing, Gandhi was being sent to jail by the British quite often. So Kumarappa would run the Gandhi's newspaper when he was out of the way, but he also got involved in Gandhi's sort of village movement. Gandhi had this vision at the time. It was pretty clear the British were going to get kicked out of India at some point reasonably soon. So this is 1920s, 1930s. So there's a big debate about what should independent India do? What should be how should it organize its society? How should it organize its economy? Most of the Congress Party, which was a nationalist party, and including Nehru, who became the prime minister, were very influenced by the Russian model, which, whatever you thought of it, had produced rapid industrialization. They did it brutally, but it did transform a rural country into an industrial country very quickly. So most of Indian economists argued that that's the way. They didn't believe in one party state. They wanted a democratic version of it, but that's the way the things should go. There should be a 5-year plan, massive industrialization, investment in heavy industry, steel, oil, chemicals, etc. Kumarappa didn't agree with that at all. He made the argument in several books, which I write about, that India should rely on its traditions of village-based commerce, its handicraft industries. And he said there should be some large industries, but they should be restricted and under government control. The bulk of the economy should be based on handicrafts and should be based on the village movement. And basically, commune-type villages, which would be organized into networks so they could trade with each other. And he argued that this was, A, much more sustainable. He was the sort of prophet of sustainability. And B, it actually was more beneficial to people and people's welfare. He made the argument, following Veblen and others, that most sort of consumption is just for show and doesn't actually make people happy. And he has a passage which I refer to, which he compares to a local government official in India living in a very sort of rudimentary house in a village in India, sleeping on mats, etc. Compares it to a average American, with sort of air conditioners and all mod cons, as it was in the mid-century. And he said, the Indian has a better life. He made the argument that the average Indian has a better life. Now, obviously, that's a controversial argument because a lot of Indians at the time were in abject poverty. But and Kumarappa ended up losing this debate and sort of faded into obscurity. He did take part in the sort of because he was a friend of Gandhi. He was appointed to various eminent commissions by the new government of Nehru, who took over in 1947 after India became independent. But his vision was basically cast aside, and India did go down the route of 5-year plans, massive industrialization. And as a result of that, they did industrialize, and to some extent, but there was also massive environmental degradation, and India, has got a lot of big environmental problems because of that heritage. So Kumarappa, I think people are now rediscovering him, especially in the sort of degrowth movement, but also in the global South, saying, maybe there's something in this sort of sustainability argument and sort of promoting local industry, promoting handicrafts, etc. So I thought it was worth trying to pluck him from historical obscurity, because I think he is an important figure. And he was making these arguments again in the 1920s and 1930s when they were pretty novel. I mean, people make the same arguments a century later.
Yeah, we're seeing, again, just seeing so many different parallels throughout history of issues that were, relevant at the time and that are, have come up again today, right? And I think a great example of this is a new technology, right? Obviously, this wasn't around during Kumarappa's time or others, but AI is this new, paradigm shift really in technologies, and it's causing this, a big burden that is only going to increase on, energy consumption. And therefore, if that consumption is of fossil fuels, it's going to have a huge negative impact on the environment. But, as you read your book today, it's really impossible not to see the parallels of what's happening to so many workers that either have already been or are on the verge of being displaced by AI, and those skilled workers, back in the early industrial revolution that were displaced by machinery, the early machinery. And I think, the term Luddite gets thrown around today like as a pejorative, right? Mostly by people don't really know what it is. So could you tell the story of the Luddites?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for the reasons you said, the Luddites are fascinating. I mean, I grew up in Northern England, which is where Ludditism arose in the 1810s and 1820s, and it was basically a reaction against industrialization. The automation of its day was moving into factories using power looms instead of hand looms, originally water, but then steam engines, using big machinery rather than hand machinery. So the immediate impact of that was to throw out of work sort of skilled artisans who had done this labor mostly in small workshops or even at home in some cases in terms of weavers for centuries, and earned a pretty good living doing it. And very rapidly, these people were immiserated. There are famous parliamentary reports from the 1930s of parliamentary inspectors going around sort of weavers' villages in Manchester and seeing people suffering from malnutrition, which I mention in the book. So Ludditism was a reaction to that on the part of these skilled artisans. And originally, now at the time, you've got to understand, Britain wasn't really a modern democracy at all. It was an oligarchy. The franchise was limited basically to people with large farmers, large property. So the industrial workers they just didn't have a vote. Despite that, they picketed or not. The first thing they did was raise petitions. Hundreds of thousands of people signed, and they sent, even though they didn't have, as I said, representation, they sent the petitions down to Parliament in London and said, look, we're faithful subjects. We've fought for the crown. These are the people in the army, etc., fighting the revolution, fighting against the French Revolution, or against Napoleon, rather. And, you have to do something for us. We're being killed up here. And the Parliament just twice said, no, that's life. They supported the property rights of the capitalists. So eventually, some of these workers took it into their own hands and started going into the factories on a night and smashing up the machinery. In a couple of cases, they killed the factory owners who sort of resisted. The government then reacted to these protests with massive repression, sending in troops. More troops were sent to Northern England at one point than were fighting in the Peninsular War against Napoleon. They put these risings down brutally. I describe one case where they sort of hung eight of these Luddites outside the courthouse in York. They sent hundreds more they packed them off to penal colonies in Australia and other places. So they put the rising down brutally, and it worked from their perspective. There were sort of sporadic risings in the ensuing years, but the basic threat to sort of early capitalism had been removed. So for decades, centuries, and when I was growing up in Yorkshire in the 1970s, Ludditism was a term of abuse. You call somebody a Luddite, it mean they were stupid, they were anti-modern, they were sort of antediluvian, or you're just a Luddite. But I think what we see now through AI, it's just you get a much sort of just instinctive appreciation of where they were coming from, because we have this new technology which looks, obviously there's huge debates among economists about how large the displacement's going to be, but everybody agrees it's going to be large. The question is just how large. And, this time it's going to, looks like previous waves of automation basically impacted working class people, factory workers in Detroit and places. Looks like this wave of automation, AI, is going to affect professional middle class people, including people with, degrees. Even the first people who have been hit most strongly are actual computer programmers. We always thought that was the most safe profession you could go into. Now they're being sort of immiserated or got rid of. So I think I think what this has given us is a new appreciation of Ludditism from two perspectives. Number one, just the moral perspective. The basis of capitalism is that the owner, the investor, has the property rights to do whatever he wants, basically to improve profits and increase production. And that if this involves displacing people, well, that's tough. They'll get jobs elsewhere, and that's just how things work. That's the process of creative destruction. I think we're seeing, there's now a more new appreciation for the losers in that process, because a lot of educated people think they're going to be the losers. So their minds have been focused. And then B, just the whole question of, is technology good has been raised as well, I think. Most economists, technology, there's no doubt about it, has led to, massive increases in GDP and productivity over the centuries. I have the famous hockey chart in my book for GDP. Now, of course, the hockey chart for carbon emissions parallels it, but there's just no doubt about it. The line goes along the axis, along the x-axis for sort of centuries, thousands of years, and then it shoots right up. That's combination of capitalism and technology. So the system is immensely productive, but so all economists have basically always argued for it. But now, as the arguments I think about technology are now being challenged, because what's the basis of it? If you sort of capitalism without workers is is a very strange concept. Who's going to get the rewards? So you see even people like Altman and Musk, the great tech barons, saying we're going to need some system of UBI, because they clearly foresee a system in which most of the rewards will go to them, right? The people who own the AI systems. So that's only sustainable. That's completely unsustainable politically. So I think even they realize the only way this can be sustainable is by some sort of a UBI. So you need the population to buy. There has to have money to be able to buy the goods. That's an old Marxist critique that capitalism doesn't work because the workers are impoverished, and it leads to overproduction and underconsumption and aggregate demand problems, which Keynes sort of picked up on. And B, it's just not going to work. I mean, at some point there'll be a revolution if 90% of GDP is going to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. So I think it raises all sorts of foundational questions. Now, it's never going to go to 90%. At the moment, it's 70% labor, 30% capital. But even if it flipped to 50-50, that would be an absolutely huge shift. So I just think all these foundational questions are being re-raised for the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think another big takeaway from the Luddite story is just how far the government will go to protect capitalism, right? Even with the most violent means. You talked a little bit about what they did to the Luddites, but you wrote about Thatcher's state-sanctioned violence against labor unions. You wrote about the murder of Rosa Luxemburg, right, by the German government. Yeah. And we're still seeing this today with Trump's most recent memo directing the National Joint Terrorism Task Force to focus on what he quote calls domestic terrorists whose beliefs are anti-American, anti-capitalist, or anti-Christian. In your opinion, would capitalism exist today without governments suppressing, the dissidents of the system?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, capitalism and government, go back to the beginning. Capitalism depends on a system of property rights enforced by the government. So ultimately, you're totally right. It's based on force, because you need somebody to enforce those property rights. Now, the current situation, I think, is more complicated than simply the sort of capitalist class, employing Donald Trump to crush the workers. Because a lot of Trump supporters are workers. There's a lot of sort of anti-immigrant racism, as well as straightforward sort of economic questions there. Trump is, in a way, I would say, he's putting forward a sort of, neo-fascist sort of version of economics, of sort of autarky, not autarky, but America first, protectionism, state intervention in the economy, directing businesses to do X, Y, Z. That sort of, but in collusion with the the great monopolists like Musk, etc. That is redolent of the sort of 1920s Mussolini model of capitalism, which was a sort of a corporatist system. So, I mean, I think that towards the end of the book, I sort of examine, what are the options here? If, as I've argued, the sort of 20th century model of capitalism is facing a crisis of legitimacy, being attacked from the right and the left, what are the possible alternatives? And as I said, I think Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, economic nationalism, is one alternative on the table. Chinese state capitalism, whatever you want to call that, is another option on the table. The left sort of degrowth option is a third option on the table. And then the big question is, what's the sort of center left and center right? What have they got to say? And that's where the big struggle is at the moment. Obviously, the parties of the center left and the center right have been decimated all over the world. I don't have a immediate solution for that. Obviously, I'd be a politician, but I basically come out of the British sort of Keynesian tradition. I'm a big defender of the sort of social democratic model of the post-war decades, which still exists in places like Scandinavia, etc. So that puts me in the sort of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren sort of wing of the Democratic Party in the US. I mean, Trump calls them socialists, but they're not socialists in the old sense at all. I don't see Mondami or AOC or Bernie arguing for nationalizing the means of production, which is what socialism originally meant. It's basically social democracy, but persuading enough voters, to vote for that is the great challenge. And then, get back to the climate, how to deal with the huge climate question, which really can't be dealt with on a national scale and has to be dealt with internationally. It's basically a global public good, a safe climate, and it can't be enforced at a national level. So I think that I'm not massively optimistic, I have to say.
Yeah, I think we can't have a conversation about history of capitalism and its critics without talking about John Maynard Keynes. You brought him up. You brought him up a couple of times. Obviously, he was for government supporting aggregate demand or maintaining aggregate demand. That's often, with could be massive investments in things like climate solutions, right? That's a great one. But I think again, I like to go back and almost place those historic economists in today's time and what they would think about today. And would in your mind would Keynes be surprised at all by this kind of rightward shift in global politics that we've seen over the last 10 plus years, basically after those austerity measures that were put in place by Western countries, during and after the Great Recession?
No, I don't think he'd be surprised at all, because in the 1930s, I mean, Keynes is a liberal, and he was a big supporter of sort of liberal capitalism. And like Adam Smith, he believed in competition. He believed in sort of individual initiative. He thought that that model of capitalism preserved liberty. He was a 19th century liberal, basically. But he also thought that capitalism had some fundamental weaknesses. And obviously, in the 1930s, both him and Karl Polanyi, who I also write about, the sort of great Austrian thinker, they, I think, both came to the conclusion that if you left capitalism to its own devices, it would lead to either communism or to fascism. Polanyi actually made that argument in a 1930s paper that I write about. Keynes thought that was definitely a danger, no doubt about it. Lots of his students in Cambridge at the time were joining the Communist Party, and some of them, eventually became some of the Cambridge spies famously became Russian spies. But communism was seen to, not just among Russian sympathizers, but the sort of Stalinist economic system, which seemed to be growing fast, was seen as a viable alternative, much as in some parts of the world people think of the Chinese system now as a viable alternative to sort of Western democracy. So I don't think Keynes would be surprised. No, as I said, by the sort of attempt to sort of create the sort of neoliberal era, a sort of new version of sort of untrammeled capitalism with no financial, not no financial, but getting rid of financial regulation, leaving everything to the markets, and then B, as you said, austerity policies. I think Keynes would be arguing for some sort of now, Keynes believed in reducing the deficit when things were going well, so he would have actually, I think, probably supported the sort of Clinton years when the deficit went down to below zero with less surplus we've ever had. But ever since then, the economy has basically been struggling, and I don't think he would have definitely opposed the sort of austerity policies in the US and Europe, especially Europe, over the last 15 years. And I don't think he'd be surprised that it's leading to political extremism either. Because, as I said, the great parallel, I think, with the current moment is the 1930s. And both him and Polanyi lived through it.
Yeah, and we started this conversation talking about Trump and Sanders, and most of this conversation is revolved around critics from the left. But as we're seeing today, as you noted, the new right has its own criticisms of capitalism. Are there instances in history of such critiques of capitalism coming from the right that maybe can explain what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, I read about Carlyle, a great sort of Scottish conservative in the 19th century, who was an authoritarian, a big supporter of Frederick the Great, and his argument was that capitalism was basically inhuman. He sort of agreed with the socialists of his time that it basically trampled people underfoot, and he said, it was the most evil system invented. He had a moral critique of it. So I think Trump or people like that, when they were criticizing American corporations for shipping jobs abroad and betraying the American workers, they were basically making a moral argument against capitalism there. Now, as I said, once he got into power, of course, he brought a lot of billionaires into his cabinet, and but we won't. This is not a discussion of Trump, but sure, there are and then of course there have been all sorts of right-wing regimes around the world, even before Trump, who've introduced some forms of economic nationalism and protectionism, going back to the original sort of fascist regimes in the interwar period. The Nazis were the only major economy that has really succeeded in creating a completely autarkic model where they basically completely limited imports. So there is this vision from the right of a sort of, economy ruled by diktat. And it's always appealed to a certain, part of the population, I think. And the sort of strong man could come along and make things better. That argument has always had, unfortunately, some popular appeal.
Yeah, and we can wrap up here with one last question. That's not an easy one, right? It's not easy at all. But back in 1999, the protests at the WTO in Seattle, that was a backlash against globalization, right? And the Occupy Wall Street movement in the early 2010s, that was a backlash to the massive wealth and power inequality that was experienced here in America and really across Western countries. These protests are part of this long history of public pushback against the exploitative nature of capitalism, which we've touched on multiple times in this conversation. And there hasn't been any end to this, right? Even though Marx and others predicted, but there has to be something, right? There just has to be, right? And I'm just wondering.
I mean, one of the people I just mentioned him, but Karl Polanyi had the theory, which I think we're living through it at the moment, of what he called the double movement. The first movement was the effort to create a sort of idealistic capitalist utopia. Free markets, let the corporations do what they want, chop the government down, leave everything to the markets and the corporations. And he said that's what happened. That was basically 19th century Britain. But it produces a reaction in the form of in Britain, Chartism, and in Europe, there's various revolutionary movements, etc. But most substantially, the union movement, the labor movement, the growth of the Labour Party, the growth of the SPD in Germany, growth of the Socialist Party in France, basically a counter movement. And he called that the double movement. So his argument was that's how capitalism evolves, in these double movements. You get a wave of sort of deregulation, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, and then you get a counter wave. So I think what we're living through is the sort of double movement in action, the reaction to global sort of free market capitalism on a global scale, globalization, as producing this double movement. Both on the right, the populist right is a reaction to that, America first, whatever, and on the left too. Now, the sort of issue, I think, on the left is what's the alternative actual program? Trump, whatever you think of him, he's got a program. He's going to basically tariffs, leaves things to me. I'll do deals with corporations and things will be okay. The issue, I think, on the left is what's the rival program, and I think that's where the debate, it should be focused, including not just tackling inequality, obviously, tackling environmental and global warming, and also democracy, because what we've seen, and again, this wouldn't have surprised Polanyi at all, is that capitalism and democracy, which, the great 19th century ideal is that they're mutually reinforcing. I mean, what we've seen in recent years is that's not necessarily true. And, you've basically, when you have Elon Musk basically running the government for a while until he got kicked out. And, obviously again, we're sort of straying into current affairs rather than history, but this equation, which has sort of been at the basis of all liberalism, really, that capitalism, democracy, and natural allies, I think is now in question.
Yeah, and I do hope that, one, that there's someone in the Democratic Party that is crafting that plan, right? Crafting that viable alternative. And two, I hope that they read this book, because there are so many great criticisms of capitalism in here that they can incorporate into that new solution, that path forward that hopefully overcomes some of the the problems in the past and problems that we're obviously experiencing today. We have left out so many incredible contributions from capitalism's greatest critics in this conversation. So, if you enjoyed this conversation, I highly recommend you go out and buy the book, Capitalism and Its Critics, A History from the Industrial Revolution to AI. We'll include a link to the book in our show notes, so it's super easy for you to go get the book. John Cassidy, I so greatly appreciated reading this enlightening book, and for you joining me today on the Climate Pod.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed our talk. It went very quickly.